Right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this third study. Harley's eating, so it may be
I'll do it if you like. I don't.
need a different volunteer to read.
I can jump in. Honestly, I don't mind.
You sure?
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
So it's not the whole story of Samson, but it's the end of Samson. And this week's theme is Samson, the suicide bomber.
Yes.
So it's the end of the story, which is the bit that's relevant here.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Right. So, Judges 16. When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he has told his story secret to me." Then the lord of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 10 locks of his head.
7.
He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." When he awoke from his sleep, he thought, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson and let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of vengeance I may back the Philistines for my 2 eyes. I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes, forgive me." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He strained with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's all right.
And Hebrews, we return to Hebrews, where we've been a couple of other times in this series. I'll let you get on with your eating, Harley. I'll read this bit, maybe.
If you like.
Sorry?
I can read it.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Thanks.
And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect.
Thank you. So, the story of Samson, and this particular bit, the bit where he brings the temple down on him and everyone else. And and Samson is commended by the writer to the Hebrews, as we've just heard. So the usual sort of question to begin with. So what do we make of this story of Samson's death, and how do you react to it? Are you comfortable with it?
I mean, one has to be quite honest that there is something thrilling about the story, and that's quite dangerous.
Yep.
I don't know. I hope it's relevant, but Francois Truffaut once said that you can't make an anti-war film because war is quite thrilling when put on the screen. It is sort of naturally quite exciting, and there's something similar going on in a way. It does kind of, it's an awful subject, but I think it still kind of rouses you in a strange way. And I can see why, as you said before, people might sort of say, oh, it's a great story, and not think, well, but he's a suicide bomber. Essentially, he's essentially doing what suicide bombers do. So, but anyway, so I guess reading it, it does have a certain kind of pull to it, I think.
I mean, I
can't
like
be
the
denied.
I like the quote from Truffaut because
Yes.
yeah, I mean, we watched a couple of weeks ago. We watched what's the film called? All Quiet on the Western Front, the new version of it, and that is a pretty unglamorizing film about war. But I can see other war films
Yeah.
can have
Sure.
however much you want them to be anti-war.
I mean, I suppose Truffaut's statement, you could consider it quite dated. I mean, he probably wrote it or said it in the 60s. But even with the sort of anti-war films and the ones that really show the horrors of war, they're usually still quite thrilling in a strange way. Also, that I mean, they're usually there's usually a sort of tension to them that in a different film like The Matrix you would not be sort of derided for enjoying. But anyway, sorry, enough of that.
Really important point, and it's interesting. I looked through the PowerPoint this evening and added the question: are you comfortable for it to be taught to children? Because of course, as we'll see a bit later, it is a staple of Sunday school. This particular story.
Yes.
My earliest remember of the story of Samson is a children's encyclopedia, but this guy pushing two great big pillars. So yeah, that's sort of allure of violence is there in it as a children's story.
Yes. Yeah.
We didn't read the bit about Delilah because she was in it for the money, and I think we should have read that bit as well.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot more we could have read there, but yes, I think that's important. Yes, it's not just.
She wasn't loving him.
You can remember Delilah too. Yeah. So what do we do with it? Are you comfortable with it being in the Bible?
I mean, it's there, isn't it? I mean, and it's. I mean, I think what really striking with your title, Samson the Suicide Bomber, and that kind of equation with terrorists. I think I feel similar to what Harley's saying, really, that there's something in this massive drama. I mean, it's such an exciting story, and it's got buildings crashing down and people being deceived by their lover, and all of this stuff. It's a great story, and I think I then can equate it to the terrorist, in that the terrorist exerts horrendous violence in response to violence that's being perpetrated against them.
Yep.
So their response is to an injustice. And Samson's response is to a terrible injustice on him. He's been betrayed by his lover. He's had his eyes gouged out. I mean, he's not going to be a happy man. So if this story is saying this is how God wants the world to be, I am extremely uncomfortable with it being in the Bible. If the story is describing part of the human condition, which is that violence is exerted in response to violence, therefore, going back to Harley's thing, therefore, to be anti-violence, you need to tell the story in some way. Whether it succeeds, I don't know, because the context is always, as Samson being the judge of Israel and therefore a goody. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think scholars, I think, are divided about where the story as a whole is taking us, but the feeling, I think, seems to be that they're not commending Samson as a person. Having said that, some interpreters, and particularly sort of in more devotional literature and in preaching, do take Samson as a heroic figure, and particularly what happens at the end. So despite what the scholars might say, in practice, Samson seems to be up with the heroes. So both those comments are right in a sense. Yeah. I mean, the overall message of the story is not that we're supposed to act like Samson does. But on the other hand, the way that this story is used, it looks as if we should do. It looks as if he should be an inspiration to us.
That's the Hebrews.
About that, like Hebrews, and the fact that it is a staple of Sunday school. I mean, when I mentioned it to my wife, I was doing something on Samson. She said, "Oh, Samson," and immediately talked about being in Sunday school and having a lesson on Samson. And so for a lot of people, that's their earliest memory, like my memory of the picture of Samson in the encyclopedia. Their earliest memory is a glamorized one.
This week we studied Baader Meinhof, and next week Isis, and then Samson.
Yeah.
It's one of the nice things about that he was happy at the end. He was joyful at the end. And what's that? Is that about meeting these virgins when he gets to heaven, or some of the suicide bombers do? They think about the future and meeting these virgins, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, whether that's the case I suspect it's a sense of having got his own back on his enemies, I suspect.
Yeah.
But there's an uncanny, which I think is on the next slide, an uncanny, yes, picking up on that. The first extract here is from, the reference is in the little booklet, but it was a devotional retelling of Samson that I bought precisely so I could quote from it. And it says, "The last thing I saw before I became unconscious was the slave," Samson said. So it's written up by someone as if they were one of the bystanders when Samson destroyed the temple. He'd not moved from his spot between the pillars. His great head was lifted up and his sightless face gazed aloft. I heard him give a great cry of joy as if he were welcoming his God, and then he died. I swear I've never seen such peace and joy, yes, and gratitude on a human face. And interestingly, that book was written late 90s, I think, early 2000s. Certainly, it was certainly written before 9/11. I'm sure, I'm pretty certain of that. So late 90s. So the suicide bombing in the recent sense of the word wouldn't be in that man's mind, I suspect, writing it. And then there's a quote here from a news report. Some of them are related, apparently. "Ecstatic in the last moments," says Marawi, that's the person they're interviewing. "You probably remember the description of the suicide guy who drove a truck into the Marine barracks in October 1983. He was described by the guard at the entrance to the compound, and the guy said amazingly, he was smiling."
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got Samson was happy, and suicide bombers apparently look happy, and that's not the only reference. There are other references I think I could quote. So that was an interesting point you made, Sue. And we're not told why Samson was happy. We can guess why he was happy, and it's probably not a particularly worthy reason, I suspect.
Mm.
And
I think one difference between Samson and a lot of suicide bombers is suicide terrorist attack is that very often people have been used in some way, that quite vulnerable people have been groomed to do the work for others.
yes,
And then, the people who are guiding and directing and initiating this are actually not on the front line themselves. I mean, they're not putting the backpack, of dynamite and walking into underground stations or whatever. And whereas Samson is making, a deliberate choice, and it isn't that he's just decided as a change of heart to kill all the Philistines. He was killing them before they gouged his eyes out. They gouged his eyes out because he was so successful at killing them.
yes,
So you're in this kind of really cycle of violence between the two parties. It doesn't resolve itself until all of them die. It's an eye for an eye, makes everyone blind, isn't it?
yes, yeah, literally in this case, yes.
Mm.
Is part of the problem in the way that the story is retold, though? Because I'm struggling to find in that passage where it says that Samson was happy. He kind of makes a statement of this is going to be a great thing, but I suppose you could argue that shows he's happy. But the other thing is, it doesn't really show that God is with him.
No.
God left him before. Doesn't say that God has returned to him at this point. And I think I'm less unhappy about this story being in the Bible than the other ones we've looked at, because if you tell it straight, it's like a parable or a folk tale or a fairy tale, and you leave it to the listener to draw their conclusions. But the problem is, I think we've a bit like what Victorians did to old folk tales. We've tried to bend them to fit the culture of the time and make sense within our culture. So for example, sorry, it's slightly off the point, but we have all these stepmothers in folk tales. They weren't stepmothers in the original. Most of them, they were mothers. It's just that for Victorians, it was too abhorrent to actually have them as mothers.
Oh, really?
So change them to stepmothers.
Oh, gosh.
So, that had to fit the culture of their time. But actually, if you go back and retell it, Angela Carter does, these stories with mothers in them, it's very interesting what happens. I'm not going to pursue that now because that would be far too much for divergence. And I just wonder if the invitation here is to just tell the story. It's there, and we can learn from it if we hear it as it is, but we can't learn from it if we've already decided what it is, because there's nothing to learn.
And we often have decided sort of what it means because we're told by preachers and material that somehow Samson prefigures Christ, and in a sense that gives us, that closes off a different meaning.
Yes.
Where does that come from, Peter? This prefiguring of Christ? Is it just the way he holds his arms out? Or?
I read a whole article about this. Some commentators that literally do identify the outstretched arms as prefiguring the cross. Others that he died to defeat sin, evil, whatever. He gave his life, inverted commas. Well, let me just jump ahead because I've got a couple of comments and I'll come back. Samson gave his life so that he could defeat the Philistines and the Israelites could be freed. In some ways, Samson's story reminds us of Jesus. Jesus also died in order to save others. That's Samson for Kids, which is something I found online. A commentary, like quite an extreme commentary, but this commentator said we learn something encouraging about Samson from what the Philistines say. They admit that he has been the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. What a great testimony. We learn from this that Samson did a mighty work indeed during his 20 years of judgeship. So, and that's in the context of a commentary that does talk about a war against secular humanism. So if you want to read that sort of stuff out of Samson, you can do. Samson can be encouraged with the Christian counter culture wars, and Samson can be read as a prefiguring of Christ. And I think it's just important to be aware of these things, because I looked at quite a lot of commentaries for this article I wrote, which is separate from the little booklet that we're using. And I looked at quite a lot of commentaries post 9/11, and only one, I think, made any reference to suicide bombing. Given that however closely you want to align what Samson was doing, what a suicide bomber does, there are definitely parallels there and things that we can learn from that. I was surprised. It was a political scientist who actually noticed the resemblance. I don't know how you pronounce the name, Shadiah Drury, I think it's pronounced. So 2 years after 9/11, she wrote an article. It was in a social science context. It was in a social science journal, not in a religious theological journal at all. And she said, morally speaking, the two crimes were identical. In both cases, innocent victims were buried alive in the rubble. Innocent people met a gruesome death that they could not have anticipated or deserved. It is difficult not to conclude that Samson was as much of a terrorist as Atta. Yet we regard Atta as a criminal and the incarnation of evil, but we go on with the Bible in portraying Samson as a hero. Is there any difference between them that would justify such radically different assessments? And then she says it may be argued that Samson was merely an instrument of God's will, sacrificing his own life in order to carry out the justice of God. But she continues, if we accept this excuse for Samson, we must also accept it for Atta. And then she says the conclusion she comes to is that once the world is understood in these terms as a cosmic struggle between good and evil, it becomes clear why Samson is a hero and Atta is a villain. Samson is on our side. That is all. And I think that is quite revealing, because certainly some of the commentators who like the second one I mentioned, that commentator there, in his mind, there's clearly an us and them situation. And so the Samson story is very good for Christians operating in an us and them situation, because he's winning a victory for us over them, as it were. And so it raised a couple of questions for me that I thought would be worth just thinking about, is how we can move away from a view of the world as divided to a vision of the world as one. Because essentially, the Samson story thrives on this idea of a divided world, an us and them situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's how you view so many situations, isn't it? As being one. I mean, Ireland, Protestant versus Catholic, Palestine, Arab versus Jew, United States, black versus white, and if you view the world in those binaries, then one is right and the other is wrong. So you get the kind of situation with, dare I mention it, Jeremy Corbyn, because I think he's coming here this week. But I mean, the mistake that the Labour Party made with Corbyn was to say, in order to oppose what Israel is doing in Palestine, you have to then demonize, the Jewish people, and that has just polarized in a really unhelpful kind of way. So one group then feels totally alienated, another one feels vindicated. Whereas what you want is something which is more nuanced, that recognizes where those differences are and where those extremes are, but also where the points of meeting are. The people who who can contribute from the other side to bringing sides together, if that makes any sense. Because there's plenty of Israelis, plenty of Jewish people who oppose their, the behavior of their government.
I think that I'm thinking of two things. I'm thinking of about 25 years ago going to Northern Ireland when I was doing some research for a play in Belfast, and going to a service of reconciliation in a Catholic church, and it was on a Sunday night, and they'd invited members of the Protestant community to kind of cross the divide, literally cross the barrier, and come to the service, and they did. Quite a number did, and I'm sure it was integral. It was after the Good Friday Agreement, but I'm sure it was integral in terms of fixing it. But the key part of the service for me was when people were asked to get into mixed groups and to share with each other their stories of how they'd suffered through the conflict. And it was so, the person I was with, Rob, who was the writer of this play, and myself, we weren't obviously part of it. We were kind of sitting on the edge, but it was so moving, just seeing the tears flowing, usually from the listeners, when they heard the stories from the other side, because they were the same stories. Everybody had the same story ultimately. It didn't matter what side you were on. And the same would be true in the Samson story. Yes, the Israelites have suffered, but so have the Philistines. And if they told their stories to each other, it would be, you can't then hate in the same way. And it's from that. And the other thing is, I was in a seminar on, I can't remember when, Sunday or Monday, with a Buddhist storyteller who works from a tantric tradition, who said something blindingly simple, but all the things that divide us are things that are just self-imposed. So, racial characteristics only exist because we've given them a voice. There doesn't have to be any racial division. People didn't realize they were a particular color until they were told they were, and it was different from other people's. Gender differences don't have to be so defined, and so on and so on and so on. And who do you have more in common with? Someone who's from the same racial group or someone who's not? And once you start to explore commonality, you find often that you have commonality with those that you thought were completely different from you because of the characteristics they've been defined by. And it's tearing down those barriers and realizing we're all part of, we all tell stories and we all have a story, and sometimes it's very similar to someone else's who looks nothing like us or is apparently nothing like us. That to me is that's why this story is helpful, because this story doesn't allow for that. But sometimes you need to present the negative to then follow it up with, this is the alternative.
But the shared experience is shared pain, isn't it?
Yes.
I remember I did some work with a Rwandan psychologist who he said some really interesting things, but he said, you come into a room and your sworn enemy is in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And, you go to attack your sworn enemy. Your sworn enemy runs out of the room and bangs his head on the door and collapses. And it completely changes your approach to the enemy because there's somebody who's vulnerable and suffering in front of you. I mean, I don't know, I can't remember exactly how he told it, but it was really, really powerful kind of thing. Once you see that commonality of suffering, then that changes your approach to your enemy. And I think that is what very often happens in kind of reconciliation. If you remember the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, when Tutu sobbed, started to cry, and people were telling their stories, you know. That is really, really cathartic, and that shitters. But the other thing the Rwandan psychologist said was really interesting, was that it was much easier to bring reconciliation between the two factions inside Rwanda, because people were still living in the same villages, the same areas, and so on. So they could not walk down the street without seeing each other. But the diaspora, the refugees, lived in, you know, groups of one political group, and another political group lived in another part of town or in another country. And actually bringing reconciliation amongst refugees was much, much harder, because they didn't need to address their enemy. They could just, amongst themselves, continue to stoke up the hatred and the resentments.
Isn't one of the bravest things we can do as human beings to let go of our perceived right to be hurt or angry? You know, it's very hard to let that go. If someone has hurt us, then we want to. It's our pain, and we kind of almost nurture and treasure it, and so on, like Samson does here. But I think one of the most courageous things you can do, if not the most courageous thing you can do, is actually say, no, I'm not having that. It's not part of me, and I choose not to have it. I always remember the father of someone who was killed in the Enniskillen bombing, you know, forgiving the terrorists very publicly, very quickly afterwards. I think his name was Gordon, something or other. And I just thought, my goodness, you may not even feel that right now, but you've chosen to say, that's not me, I'm not going to have that. I think it's incredibly courageous.
It's a bit of an aside, but I usually quote Gordon Wilson when I'm teaching stuff on the atonement, and people say, oh, yes, but God has to kill his son in order to forgive us. And I say, well, God managed to do it without anything. Yeah, I think that's a really good. And we've begun to answer. We've answered the second question already, really, how we can begin to see the world through the eyes of others is by talking to others and actually finding out that their experience is remarkably similar to our own.
But the thing that keeps worrying me about this Samson story is that there's nobody left. You know, how do you reconcile when everybody's dead?
Yes.
Yeah, but then there's the brothers, isn't there?
Oh, is there?
His brothers and his father can have a choice then, can't they? Do they keep it going, or do they?
Ah, yes. Yes.
So, you know, and it passes down generations. You know, and there's something that's fascinating. Sorry, this is way off the point, so shut me up if. No, you probably can't anyway. Something that's fascinated me is the legacy of the Second World War. Because, and I'm not going to go into my own story now, it's too complex, but my mother had a very complex relationship with the Second World War, and there was a lot that she wasn't able to forgive in that. And I've kind of, partly through my own therapy, but partly through also doing quite a lot of research around this, there's quite a lot of evidence that unforgiveness is actually something that does pass down almost genetically to children if it's something you don't deal with in your own lifetime. And, you know, there's a lot of psychological work around this now that's emerging. It's a growing kind of idea that it has a physical impact literally has a physical impact on you, and it's then hard for the next generation because they don't know what they're angry about. You know, it's unforgiveness is just such an awful thing. I mean that in the whole meaning of that word, really. It's scary how powerful it is, but it's also truly terrible. You know, it scares me how many wars we have going on, because how much unforgiveness comes from that, and how much a future generation's going to carry with them as a result. Yeah, it's and that's what I mean about the, I never understood this thing about the sins of the fathers. Always thought that was really unfair, but it's starting to make sense to me now, in a different way.
Gosh. And I guess if we continually see the world in binary terms, like the story of Samson does, and a lot of well, not a lot, but some of the Bible does too, the rest of the Bible does too, then we're also propagating a view of us and them, and a sense of unforgiveness, that you still get these people who are strongly opposed to what they call secular humanism, or to those who are threatening the faith.
I haven't read the story in detail. I don't really want to, actually, but the shooting in the gay nightclub. But I saw a tweet saying something like, it didn't take a man with a gun to stop a man with a gun. It took two gay men, unarmed, to stop it. And it's that thing that you get in the United States about gun control. I mean, saying to churches, if you want to protect yourselves, that shooting in a black church a few years ago, the gun lobby was saying, if they had had guns in the church, they wouldn't have died. Just utter nonsense. But how do you get over? I mean, it's this sense, this obsession with security, and the response to terrorism is more security, more armed police, airports and whatever. I mean, how do you, very practically deal with the threat of terrorism that isn't just increasing the level of violence which the terrorists are trying to oppose? It's very complex.
I don't think we can do it on their terms. I don't think you can deal with it practically. And I think it's where we're called to be idealistic. We know that love casts out fear. And I think we have our own little patch. We have our own relationships. We have the opportunity to demonstrate love, conquering fear. And like ripples in a pond, I think the only thing we can do is change the culture. But you don't change it by dealing with it on its terms. We won't ever win that argument. You can't possibly. It's ridiculous. It's like the guy in Ireland, I think I've quoted him before, who, when I asked for directions, told me he wouldn't have started from where I was. You just don't start from there. It's not where God asks us to start from. He tells us what love can do. And that stuff, all the security stuff, comes from fear, doesn't it? Fear of the other, fear of the one who's not like me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have to show the opposite, and I think that's what we do. I mean, I have a transgender child, and although we didn't come last Wednesday, the fact that Union Chapel had a transgender a service, transgender remembrance, just knocked her for 6, because she grew up in a Christian environment, but she so thoroughly rejected it. Now she's having problems rejecting it in a good way. That's the kind of thing.
It was a very, very powerful evening. It's a shame.
I bet it was.
Very powerful. Very good speaker.
Is there a film of it, Vaughan, on the website?
I don't think so. No, we didn't film it, did we, Holly?
No, sorry.
Doesn't matter.
If I had known, I would have. Sorry.
Oh, that's my fault. I should have said, but just the fact it was there was huge,
Oh, that's good.
and that's love.
Yeah. Bless her.
Yeah. And there's something very beautiful actually in that group of people. I mean, just such a gentle group of people. Yeah.
I mean, that's the irony about the shooting in a gay nightclub, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
It makes no sense.
We talked about these quotes, the one from Samson for Kids, and maybe there's a way in which the Samson story could be taught in Sunday school that doesn't glamorize Samson, that does actually get something out about how violence becomes a vicious circle. There could be all sorts of creative ways in which children could be taught that story. But as you reminded us right at the beginning, Neil, Harley, you reminded us right at the beginning, these stories of violence do have an allure to them, and that's the worrying thing. That however hard we try to sort of make a non-violent message out of a violent story, there's still the allure.
There's something thrilling about it, you know. Just reading it, it just lends itself to a certain, I don't know, like you do get involved in it in a strange way. Yeah.
It's drama, isn't it? It's drama.
It's drama, yeah.
Real drama. All those lies that he tells, you know, Delilah, like his strength for us, you know, it just builds up the story, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it.
I just keep thinking of Tom Jones.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
Delilah. Yeah. She was a good one. Right.
Quite an interesting quote from this guy, Eric Siebert. We've been conditioned to see the Philistines as categorically bad and deserving of death. We're not encouraged to feel any degree of compassion for them, and most of us do not. It's a testimony to how well the biblical writers have done their work. And it's interesting that certainly in English and in German, as far as I'm aware, the word Philistine is a derogatory term. I mean, not a mega derogatory term, but if you call somebody a Philistine, it's somebody cultured. So clearly, the biblical right, if that's got anything to do with this story, and it may well do, because we don't read about Philistines in many other places. So I suspect it probably does in some way come from this story. It's had a legacy even on language. And when we hear the word Philistine, we don't think, oh, great, lovely. We think, oh, it's
trouble.
Interesting. Any thoughts on those questions for further reflection?
Well, I'd say for number 2, we shouldn't explain it.
Right.
Tell it. Don't explain it.
Right. And hope people get from it what a positive meaning. Yeah.
Well, I think the danger in that is that people will, because it's the Bible, you know, people's instinctive response is to think, you know, it must be telling a good story, you know, it must be right. And I think that's what you've been, I think, emphasizing in these 3 sessions, is that we have to read more critically. And to read more critically does not mean that we are rejecting the Bible. We're just getting a deeper and broader understanding of why that story is there. And allowing ourselves to say, actually, this was not intended as a morality tale as to how we should behave. We shouldn't be pulling pillars of houses down if we have spent, you know, a few hours at the gym. But you know, we should look at the cycle of violence that's in this story and its consequences.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
I feel like for me, the 2 things that stood out to me as we read through the story at the beginning was, first of all, that you could switch out the Israelites and the Philistines and the name of their God, and the story could read exactly the same way. Like even the way that they're praising their God when they capture Samson, we have almost exactly the same words used when it's the other way around. And then at the end, I feel like the message of this, to my mind, is the result of revenge and violence is that everybody suffers. Even everybody's dead at the end. And I think that's the cost of violence, is that it kills our own humanity, even if it doesn't literally kill us. Like, I don't think that we can enact violence on another and not suffer ourselves. And so I guess the point that is still a bit, I mean, I feel tension about this story, I guess for a variety of reasons that we've all already mentioned. But one thing that I'm still thinking about is, like, right before Samson pulls the pillars down, he asks God for strength or help or something. And we don't know, like, it doesn't say that there's a response, but considering he had this, allegedly supernatural strength to be able to do it, do we read that as God's assistance in this or not?
Wow. That's a very good question. I mean, Samson clearly thought that God was, in terms of the story itself, whether the writer wants us, yeah, I guess the writer does want us to.
Yeah, I think so.
Because there'd be no point in telling it if well, it's impossible to, you can't do it without some sort of help. So I guess by implication, the story is telling us, yes, God did help him. But we don't have to agree with the story. But I do like very much what you suggest, Katrine, that the spiral of violence ends up with everyone dead, and in the sense that actually is, that's really the message of the story, isn't it? It's not this hero, because he just ends up killing everyone. Thank you. That's.
But I mean, that right of revenge is never one that's given to humanity, is it, in the Bible? I mean, we're not given the right to revenge. That judgment is in the hands of God. I mean, and that's kind of good thing to say, that we can't make these kind of decisions, life and death decisions for another person. They just aren't decisions that are ours to make.
Yeah.
Yes, if you want to teach it in Sunday school, you can have a colouring page where you have temple pillars crumbling, and you can draw your own Samson in there. Just to show.
Oh my God.
I think we should all do it for next week.
I love that.
Can I read something? I came across this earlier today and am illustrating it into a little booklet to give my niece and nephew, but I feel like it's relevant considering talking about how we teach stories like this to children.
Thank you.
It will be not too long. But it's written by Pau Casals. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he was a Spanish cellist, I think.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it's just an excerpt from something, and he says, each second we live in a new and unique moment of the universe, a moment that never was before and will never be again. And what do we teach our children in school? We teach them that 2 and 2 makes 4, and that Paris is the capital of France. When will we also teach them what they are? We should say to each of them, do you know what you are? You are a marvel. You are unique. In all of the world, there is no other child exactly like you. In the millions of years that have passed, there has never been another child like you. And look at your body. What a wonder it is. Your legs, your arms, your cunning fingers, the way you move. You may become a Shakespeare, a Michelangelo, a Beethoven. You have the capacity for anything. Yes, you are a marvel. And when you grow up, can you then harm another who is like you, a marvel? You must cherish one another. You must work. We all must work to make this world worthy of its children.
Wow, thank you.
Oh,
Amen.
Amen. Indeed.
Good clap.
Wow.
Lovely.
Well done.
And I think really all I want to say after that is just to underline this quote from Eric Siebert: "The Bible should never be used to hurt others."
Yeah.
If you want some more resources, if you go on that website there, that's where the study guide behind this is posted. Plus, there's some other study materials, some of which I've written and some written by others. There's also a blog. We have a blog which you're invited to read and to comment on if you're interested. And there are different events that are put on from time to time. So if you want to follow any of this up, do please do so.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
it's been so good.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Really good. Really enjoyed
Really,
it.
really good.
Thank you. Yeah.
Vaughn's
Yeah.
got my
Brilliant.
email address. Well, Vaughan and Harley got my email address if you've got any queries or anything.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
But thank you all for your contributions.
No, thank you.
Oh, you've done the work.
Mm.
It's been great. You have. It's been lovely. I've learned such a lot. Those were lovely words to finish on, Katrine. Thank you so much for.
Yes, good one.
So, do you happen to know whereabouts is Pablo Casals? Is it something particular he wrote? Is it?
I think it's from a book that he wrote. I can look it up and I can send it.
That'd be lovely, because I thought it's an absolutely wonderful quote.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's a good message to teach our children, I think.
Excellent. Good try.
Look forward very much to next week.
Yes, next week, next 3 weeks, we'll just have a look at some of the Advent lectionary readings from Isaiah. And I'm going to be using a book called Isaiah Advent and Our Jewish Neighbors. I'll just kind of tell you what it says, basically.
Great.
And I'm
That's
sure
good.
we'll have plenty to talk about.
Yeah. Great.
I hope at some point we'll have a chance to have a shared session with that Jewish group again.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
It's really funny because during the thing, I just made a note to myself to contact Rabbi Bromley. I
Good.
thought, oh yes, we should do that.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Okay. Take care.
Very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
Okay.
See you next
Bye.
week.
Good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.